thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Booksmith. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this okay? Okay. I want to say off the top, I don't normally wear a corsage. This is my husband giving me the prom I never had. So, yes, he's very, very sweet. So I wanted to just say a few words before I launch into the reading itself. A lot of the folks here tonight are people I know, friends and family. And these are people who've had to listen to me talk about this book for a very long time. A writing career, really by its nature, is based on fear, uncertainty, and doubt, especially the beginning. It's a very important career, it's a very appropriate career here in the Bay Area, which, you know, the land of the startup, and where you have to pretend to a lot of confidence you might not actually feel just in order to keep going. The only way to succeed, as far as I can tell, is if you have people who are close to you who will support you, people who understand the value of what it is that you are trying to accomplish, the ones who are willing to listen to your terrible 3 a.m. fears of failure, and your complaints about feeling isolated and having to stay in and write while everyone else is out having a drink and all that. And just who are willing to sort of watch you send the words out into the void of your computer, not knowing if anyone is ever going to see them again besides your mom. So I leaned on this community of mine pretty hard over the years, and this book would not have happened without them. Even back at the very, very beginning, it was a friend who gave me the idea for this book. I was working on a collection of linked short stories about my family and my husband's family, but I was having trouble. These were very realist stories set in a very real world with real people, and so the problem was that the stories that I was trying to tell, because they were stories that I knew already from our families, were very, very solid in my mind and resisted manipulation into fiction. And so what happened was they kind of sucked. I had a couple stories that were okay, and the rest of them were just terrible, and I knew it. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who was in the workshop and complaining about this, and she said, well, you need to really put some distance between yourself and your subject. That's the problem here. You're too close to it. And she said, you're always championing the use of the fantastical and genre elements in fiction, which is very true because I am a giant nerd. I grew up on Star Trek and Doctor Who and Bradbury and Heinlein and Tolkien and all that good stuff. And that's what on my bookshelf. That's what's on my bookshelves. And she knew it. And she said, you need to figure out how to do that. You're not writing like that, and you need to be. And I said, but I've got these stories. This is like my thesis that I'm working on. What am I supposed to do? And she said, figure it out. Take a break. And the next thing I see from you in workshop, I want it to be something fantastical. I was like, okay. So I went home and I thought about it, and I banged out a dozen pages. And instead of my Jewish girl and my Arab American boy, I had a golem and a genie. And I brought it to workshop, thinking it was going to be this fun little story. And they're like, okay, you realize this is a novel. And I went, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. And that was 7 years ago. So over the years, as the novel grew, I had my golem and my genie, and I surrounded them with their own community of immigrants and fellow countrymen, people who they had to learn to rely on in order to make their way in the human world. And so as I was working on this book for year after year after year and leaning very heavily on my community of people, and you know who you are, the golem and the genie were starting to lean on their community too, and sharing their own feelings of isolation and their own 3 a.m. fears. And this right here, this book, is the result. And my husband suggested that since this reading marks the beginning of sorts, which is the book being sent out into the world, that I should choose to read sections that describe 2 other beginnings. And to set up the first beginning, I'll tell you about what happens in the very first pages of the book, which is that we meet a man named Otto Rottfeld, who is a Prussian Jew living in the city of Conan in 1899. He is a furniture maker, he is decently well off, and he is not a very nice man. And he wants 2 things. He wants a wife, and he wants to go to America. Going to America is the easy part. All you do is buy a steamship ticket. But because he's not a very nice man, he can't get himself a wife. And so he decides what he's going to do is he's going to go to a man named Yehuda Shulman, who is the Jewish Kabbalah wizard who lives out in the woods. And he is going to pay Shulman to build him a wife, to build him a golem, a female golem. And so this is the culmination of that arrangement. The task was finished the night before Rotfeld left for the docks at Danzig. He made his final trip to Shulman's, leading a dray cart loaded with a large wooden crate, a modest brown dress, and a pair of woman's shoes. Shulman appeared not to have slept for some time. His eyes were dark smudges, and he was pale, as though drained of some essential energy. He lit a lamp that hung above the work table, and Rotfeld caught his first true glimpse of his intended. She was tall, almost as tall as Rotfeld himself, and well-proportioned. A long torso, breasts that were small but firm, a sturdy waist. Her hips were perhaps a bit square, but on her it seemed correct, even appealing. In the dim light, he spied the dark shadow between her legs. He glanced away from it as though disinterested, aware of Shulman's mocking eyes and the pounding of his own blood. Her face was wide and heart-shaped, her eyes set far apart. They were closed. He could not tell their color. The nose was small and curved under at the tip, above full lips. Her hair was brown and had a slight wave and was cut to brush her shoulders. Tentative, half-believing, he put a hand on her cool shoulder. It looks like skin. It feels like skin. It's clay, said the old man. How did you do this? The old man only smiled and said nothing. And the hair and eyes, the fingernails, are they clay too? No, those are real enough, Shulman said, blandly innocent. Rotfeld remembered handing over his case of money and wondering what sort of supplies the old man needed to buy. He shivered and decided not to think about it again. They dressed the clay woman and carefully lifted her heavy body into the crate. Her hair tangled about her face as they arranged her, and Rotfeld waited until the old man's back was turned before gently smoothing it into place again. Shulman found a small piece of paper and wrote on it the two necessary commands, one to bring her to life and one to destroy her. He folded the paper twice and placed it in an oilskin envelope. On the envelope he wrote commands for the golem and then handed it to Rotfeld. His client was eager to wake her, but the old man was against it. She might be disoriented for a time, he said, and the ship will be too crowded. If someone realized what she was, they'd throw you both overboard. Reluctantly, Rotfeld agreed to wait until they reached America, and they nailed the lid on the crate, sealing her away. The old man poured them each a finger of schnapps from a dusty bottle. To your golem, he said, raising his glass. To my golem, Rotfeld echoed, and downed the schnapps. It was a triumphant moment, marred only by his persistent stomachache. He'd always had a delicate constitution, and the stress of the last few weeks had ruined his digestion. Ignoring his stomach, he helped the old man lift the crate into the dray cart, and then led the horse away. The old man waved after the departing Rotfeld, as though seeing off a pair of newlyweds. I wish you joy of her, he called, and his cackle echoed through the trees. The ship set sail from Danzig and made its stop in Hamburg without incident. 2 nights later, Rotfeld lay in his narrow bunk, the oilskin envelope labeled Commands for the Golem tucked away in a pocket. He felt like a child who'd been given a present and then instructed not to open it. It would have been easier if he could have slept, but the pain in his stomach had grown into a lump of misery on the right side of his abdomen. He felt slightly feverish. The cacophony of steerage surrounded him, 100 diverse snores, the hiccuping sobs of babies, an occasional retch as the ship rode from swell to trough. He turned over, squirming against the pain, and reflected, surely the old man's advice was overcautious. If she was as obedient as promised, there'd be no harm in waking her, just to see. Then he could command her to lie in the crate until they reached America. But what if she didn't work properly? What if she didn't wake at all, but only lay there, a lump of clay in the shape of a woman? It struck him for the first time that he'd seen no proof that Shulman could do what he'd promised. Panicked, he fished the envelope from his pocket, withdrew from it the scrap of paper. Gibberish, meaning words, a jumble of Hebrew letters. What a fool he'd been. He swung his legs over the side of his bunk and fetched a kerosene lamp off its nail. Pressing a hand to his side, he hurried through the maze of bunks to the stairwell and down to the hold. It took him nearly 2 hours to find the crate, 2 hours of picking his way through stacks of suitcases and boxes bound with twine. His stomach burned and cold sweat dripped into his eyes. Finally, he moved aside a rolled-up carpet, and there it was, his crate, and in it, his bride. He found a crowbar, pried the nails from the crate, and yanked off the lid. Heart pounding, he pulled the paper from his pocket and carefully sounded out the command labeled to wake the golem. He held his breath and waited. Slowly, the golem came to life. First awake were her senses. She felt the roughness of wood under her fingertips, the cold, damp air on her skin. She sensed the movement of the boat. She smelled mildew and the tang of seawater. She woke a little more and knew she had a body. The fingertips that felt the wood were her own. The skin that the air chilled was her skin. She moved a finger to see if she could. She heard a man nearby, breathing. She knew his name and who he was. He was her master, her entire purpose. She was his golem, bound to his will. And right now, he wanted her to open her eyes. The golem opened her eyes. Her master was kneeling above her in the dim light. His face and hair were drenched with sweat. With one hand, he braced himself on the edge of the crate. The other was pressed at his stomach. "Hello," Rotfeld whispered. An absurd shyness had tightened his voice. "Do you know who I am?" "You're my master. Your name is Otto Rotfeld." Her voice was clear and natural, if a bit deep. "That's right," he said, as though to a child. "And do you know who you are?" "A golem." She paused, considering. "I don't have a name." "Not yet," Rotfeld said, smiling. "I'll have to think of one for you." Suddenly he winced. The golem didn't need to ask why, for she could feel it as well, a dull ache that echoed his. "You're in pain," she said, concerned. "It's nothing," Rotfeld said. "Sit up." She sat up in the crate and looked around. The kerosene lamp cast a feeble light that roamed with the ship's rocking. Long shadows loomed and retreated across stacks of luggage and boxes. "Where are we?" she asked. "On a ship crossing the ocean," Rotfeld said. "We're on our way to America. But you must be very careful. There are many people on this ship, and they'd be frightened if they knew what you were. They might even try to harm you. You'll need to lie here very still until we reach land." The ship leaned sharply, and the golem clutched at the edges of the crate. "It's all right," Rotfeld whispered. He lifted a shaking hand to stroke her hair. "You're safe here with me," he said, "my golem." Suddenly he gasped, bent his head to the deck, and began to retch. The golem watched with chagrin. "Your pain is growing worse," she said. Rotfeld coughed and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I told you," he said, "it's nothing." He tried to stand, but staggered and fell to his knees. A wave of panic hit him as he began to realize that something was truly wrong. "Help me," he whispered. The command struck the golem like an arrow. Swiftly she rose from her crate, bent over Rotfeld, and lifted him as though he weighed no more than a boy. With her master in her arms, she wove her way around the boxes, up the narrow staircase, and out of the hold.